Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. This happened a few years ago when a friend and I shared a duplex. These were owned by individual people instead of a company, so there were less people around and less staff to monitor us, and we were pretty much left to ourselves. There were a few other surrounding duplexes to our sides, and real nice looking houses across from us. Some of the duplexes looked okay, like ours, and some of the others weren't as nice and taken care of. The same went with some of the tenants. Some of them were good people, some kept to themselves, and some you tried to avoid eye contact. Thankfully, our neighbor of the attached duplex was one of the good ones. Well, at least half of them. It was an older woman, Ruby, that lived there. When we first moved in, she seemed very spry and outdoorsy too. That's part of the reason why Jess got so involved in gardening. She was always outside, planting, watering and weeding her garden bed, cleaning her patio furniture and etc. She'd make too many sweets or snacks and always bring us extras and things like that. We didn't mind at all, and otherwise, she kept to herself and we kept to ours. There was no snooping around, asking questions, and getting in each other's business either, so she was pretty much the perfect neighbor. However, Ruby had a son, Marco, that was less than welcoming, and we didn't care to see him around. He would randomly show up, and when she wasn't home, he could just be standing outside for hours until she showed up. The first time we saw him, he was sitting on her steps in a hoodie and jeans, falling asleep. We didn't have a security camera set up, so after about an hour of him sitting there, I almost went to ask him who he was waiting for when I noticed Ruby pull in. I watched through the window just to make sure because I didn't want her to be harassed or something worse if this person was a stranger. And I saw the smile on her face fade to more of a fake grin when she saw him sitting there and they started talking. She then let him in, and from there, I assumed that she knew who the person was and I let it go. Marco would randomly show up at times and could be there for a few hours, and then someone would come pick him up, or it would appear like he would stay there overnight a few times. We were finally introduced one time when we were out front smoking and he asked for a cigarette. Ruby came out shortly after and told us that he was her son and he was visiting for a while. We were polite, but the guy definitely didn't seem like he was all there. He typically looked exhausted all the time. It started to become a normal thing when he was around, and as soon as we were outside, he was asking us for a smoke, and he was over there maybe once a week. Then, for a while, it became less frequent, maybe a few days a month. But then after not seeing him for 2 or 3 months, he showed back up again, sitting on a porch with a backpack and a box. It would turn out that he would move in with Ruby. Great. She didn't look too thrilled about it either. As I started to hear them talk outside on the back patio, she would ask him about his plans, and he would get irritated and say things like he didn't know, that he didn't have any, and don't worry about me and etc. One time late at night, after he bummed another smoke from us, he asked where he could go to get cheap beer without being carded. We told him that we didn't really know and just told him about a local liquor store. He then proceeded to walk off down the street, and as we finished our cigarette, Ruby came out and apologized for her son. She said that he had been down on his luck and that she was trying to get him back on his feet, and also appreciated us for being patient with him around. She tried to offer us money for the cigarettes he kept taking, but we always refused. Sadly, they would begin arguing more. You could hear them fighting outside, and then you could hear them fighting inside. You could hear the door slamming as he left and him banging on the door to be let back in when he forgot his key. Ruby had already started to shut herself in more. We hardly saw her go outside anymore. I'd noticed on the camera that she'd go out real early in the morning in her robe to water her plants, but then she would quickly go back in. I think she had like a book club or a Bible club every Wednesday night, and a few other ladies would be over at her place. And, well, that stopped too. I felt really bad, but there wasn't really anything we could do, but just hope that he would leave soon. Well, that would soon come to fruition when he gets kicked out. They were arguing again, and after someone else equally shady showed up at her place, Marco went outside and brazenly, with a camera right on them, made a drug deal. I now understood why Ruby had been so upset. I can't imagine it was for her or that she used it at all. I shamefully went out back to listen to the fight when I heard it, and she mentioned that he was there for a new start, to kick it and get his own place. She complained that he was using again, that he hadn't found a job or even had proof that he was looking. She said that she didn't want that stuff around her, in her place, and didn't want his friends to know where she lived, so she told him to leave. I know we, for one, were thankful. He slammed the front door and started walking down the street again. I kept checking the cameras a few times to see if he would ever return, but he never did, and wouldn't the next night either. However, it wouldn't be a simple move out by any means. I am a heavy sleeper, so a few hours into my slumber, I am awoken to just banging on my door, and as I went to open it, I noticed the smell of smoke. That was the reason for her waking me up too. We started looking around, making sure nothing was on fire and trying to find out where the smoke was coming from, when we started hearing smoke alarms going off from Ruby's side. We quickly grabbed our phones and ran outside. Jess started calling 911, and I just remember frantically beating on her door to try and wake her up, but she never answered. This is where I regretted never swapping phone numbers with her. When the fire truck showed up, we told them that we thought Ruby was still inside and went to the end of our driveway to wait to see what happened. Unfortunately, Ruby was still inside, but they were able to get her out, barely alive. Not only was she in there, but she didn't answer because she had been beaten on the back of her head, causing her to pass out on the living room floor. Of course, the fire was intentionally set as well, and we had a feeling that we knew by who. Thankfully, we didn't have to point the finger, as we learned Ruby identified Marco as the one that did it. Jess ended up helping her out a lot when she was at the hospital and told her what had happened. She locked Marco out, so he ended up breaking in through the back door. They had gotten into a fight when he hit her in the back of the head, and the next thing she knew, she was at the hospital. But don't worry, she talked to him when he got arrested, and he admitted that he was high when this took place, but thought only his mom's side would burn down and was sorry for hurting us. Charmer, right? She had damage in the living room, and they had to repair the wall separating our units, so we both got put in a hotel for a while. Jess still keeps in touch with Ruby and tells me how she's doing, but I don't care for attached units anymore, and I moved into my own place as soon as I could. I have worked at a locally owned liquor store for quite a while now. In fact, I'm almost at a decade working there. I started back when I was 21 and I'm about to be 30. If there's something I can tell you about working at a liquor store, they are crazy people magnets, and those crazy people like to come out at night. And when they come out, they crave alcohol, and the only thing standing between them and what they want is at that point, me. So that said, I could probably fill out an entire novel with the weird people that I've encountered and the crazy situations that I've been in. However, just for the sake of brevity, I'll just talk about one customer in particular. He was a decent guy. There was just one instance that genuinely freaked me out. A bit of a backstory to how he came to be a customer. About 2 years ago into my working there, the store actually changed its hours to be open later because the state or county, not sure which one, had approved extended hours for liquor stores. Because of this, we went from closing at 9 p.m. to closing at midnight. I was cool with working the late shifts, so I got put on the closing, and for the most part, everything was okay. That was until the new hours attracted a very particular man. We are going to call this man Daryl. Daryl was a very strange guy that was very, very open about the things in his life to people that he barely knew. The first night that he came in, he grabbed a large handle off the shelf, came up to the register, and looked me dead in the eyes. And when I said dead in the eyes, I meant that he seriously looked dead, and he stared at me with a seriously cold and aggressive glare. I was taught from a young age that you should be nice to people you don't know because you never know what they're going through. So I looked him back and asked how he was doing on that fine evening. As soon as I said that, he said back in practically a whisper, "Don't talk." After about 10 or 20 agonizingly silent and awkward seconds, he smiled and said something to the effect of, "All right, you're pure." And at first, I thought this "don't talk" statement was the start of a robbery, like he was about to pull a gun or something. But then he gave me his half-toothless grin and kind of put my mind at ease. I rang him up and we moved on. Then the next time he came in, I asked him about the whole "you're pure" thing was about. He smiled at me and said that he had a gift that he stared into your eyes long enough, he could tell if you were a good person or not. I jokingly asked him what he would have done if his gift had told him that I wasn't a good person. And he said, "Oh, well, I probably would have killed you." And this may sound like something that would be said by someone that's making a joke or something to that effect, but the tone he had sent chills down my spine. I could tell that this man was not joking. He shrugged and then followed up with, "But we don't have to worry about that because you're pure. I can tell you won't be a problem for me." After this night, he came in several times over a few months, and for the most part of the conversations were normal. Well, as normal as they could be with him. He would talk about his job as a janitor, though he wouldn't tell me where he worked and said that it was top secret. He told me about his friends, that he went to Iraq with them, and he would tell me about the ones that didn't make it back. Every once in a while, the short conversations would be broken by him making a really hard grimace and then looking away, which told me that he had some internal issues that he was facing. Because of this, I was always polite to him, and I made it to a point to keep the conversations as light as I could. But there was one night where he came into the store in his underwear and paid in cash. You can guess where he was keeping it. Honestly, that was the night that I almost checked out of this whole thing. But he was incredibly apologetic, and he told me that he forgot his pants. And that's it. He had apparently simply forgotten to put his pants on. Like I said, it was weird, but I let it go and we moved forward. The aforementioned event that this story is actually about took place around 6 months into Daryl being a regular, almost every other day kind of customer. He and I had built quite the rapport. Hell, after the underwear thing, I would say that we were almost even friends. He had told me all about this time in the military. He had mentioned a few crazy things that he was researching, and he had even told me that he had a son somewhere out there that he hadn't seen for nearly a decade. One night in the fall, probably sometime around October or November, he came into the store and he had a look about him that I hadn't seen before. When I noticed that he seemed off, I said, "Hey, Daryl, you okay, buddy? You're not looking too good." And as soon as I asked him this, his face turned beet red and he grabbed one of the bottles off the shelf and chucked it straight at me. It hit the shelf and shattered, knocking several things down in the process. At that moment, I was seriously confused and scared. This guy had always seemed a bit out there, but this level of violence wasn't like him. I was standing in the corner, petrified, and trying to process what exactly was happening. And Daryl was standing near the shelf, smashing bottle after bottle and screaming about something that honestly made no sense. He was screaming about how everything in his life was going to hell, about how everyone that he knew was out to kill him. He started listing off what I'm assuming were events of things going wrong in his life. Then, he started screaming at me and asking if I was in on it. He was adamant that someone out there was trying to quote-unquote ruin everything in his life that he had worked so hard for. So at this point, it's 11 at night in this small town. I'm standing behind the counter with my back against the wall and my shoes covered in liquor and shards of glass. There were no other customers in the store, and there were no other employees there to help me, as I was the only closer. All the while, this guy that I was sort of acquainted with from his times buying alcohol at our store was shouting every kind of violent profanity at me. And he was starting to convince himself that, for some reason, I was one of the bad guys out to get him. He starts in on how the government was trying to find him, and that the only person he talks to is me, so the fact that they found him meant that I was the one telling them information. Obviously, I had no clue what the hell was going on about, but I was scared, and I wasn't sure how far he was going to take it. Thankfully though, while I was paralyzed, the owner of the neighboring gas station had apparently called the police. I guess he heard the screaming and the glass shattering, because after about 5 minutes of enduring the insanity that was unraveling before me, I heard the door opening and the sound of an officer screaming, "Get on the ground!" And Daryl actually started to turn his anger toward them for a moment. But I think the weight of the situation may have dawned on him, or maybe he came back to reality, because he just started sobbing and quickly got on the ground. After the insanity finally came to an end, the owner of the store showed up and asked me, alongside the police, what had happened. I told him that I didn't know. I told him everything I knew about Daryl, and that he just showed up enraged and started trashing the store. I felt bad, honestly. It was midnight, and this poor guy had clearly had an episode. But after all was said and done, I found out that Daryl actually did have a few mental issues, and he was apparently off his meds for a while. On top of that, he wasn't supposed to be drinking while taking his medication, so it was a recipe for something to go wrong. And like I said though, he was fairly normal for most of our interactions, but this one night, he had apparently snapped and I had just said the wrong thing to him. My manager and I talked about the situation and he decided not to press charges against Daryl, so as long as he could pay for what he destroyed. I actually pitched in half for it. I think it was something like $150. And sadly, Daryl only came in one more time, and he actually did so to apologize to me personally. He said that he had issues and that he didn't mean to scare me. I told him that I understood. I shook his hand, and that was the last time he and I ever interacted. I personally just hope that he's doing all right.
I have family members that live in the middle of nowhere, way outside of any major town or anything. And of course, they are the family that I tend to go see during the holidays. Thanksgiving is one of the major holidays for my family, as it was my grandmother's favorite day, and we get all the extended family on her side together to have a lovely meal, and it's always been a good time. This story isn't about the get-together, though. It's about something that happened after the fact. Most years, I would stay at my aunt's house and leave early the next morning. But on the year that this happened, I was working for a company that was doing a merger with another organization, so they pretty much had shut off all time-off requests, only the specific holidays. And because of this, I had to get home that night so that I could get up at 6 a.m. and get to the office early the next day. If nothing else, it was a pain in my ass, as I hate driving late at night, especially for the full hour that I have to drive to the north to get home. And the fact that they live out in the middle of nowhere means that there are literally no streetlights. I tried to leave at a good time, but it was hard to leave my family that night as they wanted to continue talking and spending time together. So, by the time I got out of there, it was around 10:30 at night. I get out of the driveway and out onto the really dark roads, trying to keep my eyes open and my mind focused on the trip. I was definitely struggling, like, really struggling, to keep myself awake. I think that digesting all that food and the hard spike in my blood sugar had really started to take its toll on me. I could feel my eyelids starting to drop as I was going. The longer I went, the harder it was to keep myself going, so I figured that the best course of action for me was to put on some music. Unfortunately, I do have an older car that doesn't have any sort of wireless connectivity, so when I listen to music, it has to be on a CD. The disc that I had in was not going to be enough to keep me awake. I needed something heavy and aggressive. So I ejected the CD and slowed down a bit so that I could reach down onto my floor to grab my CD folder, which is something that I will say was incredibly stupid. I was taking my eyes off the road and focusing on reaching down to grab my CD holder. Like I said, stupid. But it's what I did. I reached down, grabbed my folder, and grabbed the disc for some metal band. And when I looked back up at the road, I noticed a figure standing there in the middle of the road. I panicked, and I slammed my brakes to do my best to avoid hitting whatever or whoever this was. Thankfully, despite the car being old, it did have a good braking system, and I was able to stop pretty quickly without flipping my car or driving into the trees in the shoulder. When I came to the screeching halt, I was gripping the wheel and just trying to breathe through my excruciatingly painful heartbeat that was pulsing in my head. I honestly thought that I was about to have a heart attack, considering how high my blood pressure was over those couple of seconds. After a few moments of taking deep breaths and just staring at my dashboard, I finally was able to get my mind back to reality, and then realized that I needed to make sure that I actually didn't hit whatever that was. I looked up and out all of the windows and in the mirrors, trying to see if I could see anything. But there was nothing there. I was confused, panicked, and trying to not literally pass out. Where the hell had this thing gone? And what the hell was it? I pulled the car over to the side of the road and parked it so that I could get out and look around to see what was going on. I stepped out onto the road and walked a bit back, looking out into the shadows of the road that was lit only by my taillights. I stared at the darkness, squinted, trying to see if there was anything there, when I did finally see something. In the darkness, I could see what looked to be that same figure. Still mostly shapeless, but almost human-shaped. Just standing in the darkness and looking in my direction. I lifted my hand and waved and shouted back to see if this was a person, and if they were okay. I shouted, "Hey, is everything alright?" And as I did, this figure just stood there completely motionless. I was starting to get freaked out, thinking that this wasn't a person, that it was something else. Something supernatural. I started to walk backwards toward my car, keeping my eyes on this figure, and as I got to my car and reached toward the handle, I heard what sounded like laughing. Like a high-pitched giggling voice in the distance, out in the direction of whatever that thing was. That was all that I needed to hear. I threw my door open, jumped in, and I took back off down the road to continue my trip. I drove the rest of the way in silence, my heart keeping up its stupid fast rate, staring in my rear view mirror every 10 seconds to see if this thing was following me somehow. Obviously it wasn't. Whatever the hell that demonic thing was, it stayed there in the dark, a fact for which I was very thankful. I got home and I struggled to go to sleep that night, just kind of staring at the ceiling with my heart pounding like hell. Honestly, I don't think my BPM dropped below 120 until the next morning. Like, my body was reacting intensely to this whole thing. Like my instincts knew that whatever this was truly dangerous, and it would have been much worse had I not taken off. To this day, I still can't explain what happened on that drive home. I've tried to rationalize it as my imagination just running wild or some sort of prank, but deep down, I know that something truly terrifying was watching me. I've since avoided that stretch of road. I actually found another way to get home from my aunt's house, and the memory of that night haunts me. For anyone that has any sort of name for this thing, or a better explanation, please do let me know. I really can't physically describe it, other than it seemed to just be a living shadow on the road that stared intently. It looked like a person, sort of, but it was mostly shapeless beyond that. It was just intensely dark and creepy. I know that this doesn't help much, but it's the best that I've got for it. Anyways, that's my story, and I hope that I never experience anything like this for the rest of my days.
I was recently having a conversation with my mom about some things from my childhood, and during this conversation, she asked me if I remember the time that I was obsessed with aliens. When she mentioned it, at first I couldn't really remember any of it at all. But then, after she started talking me through the things that I used to say, do, and the games that I would play with myself and my toys, it slowly started to trickle back into my memory. This was around when I was 6 at the oldest. At some point during that year, I started telling my mom that I was no longer a person and that I was one of them. I would refuse to elaborate on what or who that them was, but soon after I told her this, I started asking her questions about space. I would ask her random questions about what existed in space, as if I expected her to know, and when she would tell me what she thought, I would just tell her that she was wrong, but then would refuse to elaborate. Not long after that, I started showing a major interest in anything that was space-related or alien-related when it came to toys. I would ask her for a toy rocket ship, spaceships, and I even asked her to paint my ceiling black and put stars on it so it looked like the night sky. I'll give her credit on that one. She actually did paint it black and then put those little glow-in-the-dark stars and planets on it. I remember that my ceiling looked like that when I was young, but I didn't recall that I asked for it to be like that. I thought it was just a cool thing that they had done for me when I was a kid. She said that I would play with my action figures, and every time that I would play with them, there would always be some sort of planned space adventure for them to go on. They would always be saying goodbye to their friends because they knew that they wouldn't be coming back, and would always load into their ships and would fly off into space. There were even times where the captain of the ships would give speeches to the rest of them, talking about how important these trips were for the future of the world. Of course, with all this, my mom would always call me her little astronaut, and I would tell her that I couldn't be an astronaut. She asked me why, and I told her that I wasn't allowed to go back to space unless they came and got me again. And no elaboration on who they were or why I wasn't allowed back in space. Of course, all of this sounds like a fun and kind of cute thing that a child would come up with. But after she told me about all of this, the reason why I had this sudden interest in this came back to me. I believe I was abducted when I was a child, and I remember a significant portion of all of that happened. That night, I recall that I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but I couldn't. Now, I was 6, so I had no real understanding of insomnia or reasons as to why I wouldn't be able to sleep. I just remember that I would close my eyes and feel like I needed to open them. At one point, I got out of the bed, and I remember feeling like I needed to look outside, out into the backyard. I walked over to my window, and I moved the curtain to look out back. And I remember getting hit with the weirdest feeling. To explain it would be difficult, but I'll say that it felt like the time around me became a solid object, like everything had slowed down to a stop. But it wasn't as if it had just slowed down. It felt like it was being held down by something that was pliable, like an actual force. I know it sounds really weird, but it's the only way that I could think to truly explain it. I was also affected by this weird force, and I couldn't move, breathe, blink, or even really think. All I could do was stare out into the yard, and my brain struggled to process what I saw. I know that there was a weird shadow that was moving toward me, and a bright light that was above the yard. And while it was bright, it was more like it was glowing than shining. It wasn't lighting up the entire yard, but it was emanating a very bright and discernible light. I just stood there, staring at it for an indiscernible amount of time, but nothing moved. I really don't know how long I stood there, staring at the light, but by the time everything came to an end, I just remember blinking and standing in the hallway of my house. For however long I was standing in my bedroom, staring outside at this light and this moving shadow thing. Then, the next moment, I'm in the hallway of my house, nowhere near my bedroom. I ended up confused and terrified, and I didn't know what to do. So I ended up going to the living room and crying myself to sleep. I remember that much. A lot of the time after that is a bit of a blur, but my mom told me that this is when my obsession with aliens all started. I am fully convinced that I was abducted, and I have to assume this was some kind of alien abduction, obviously. But thinking back on it, the fact that I cannot remember anything between seeing the light and waking up in the hallway tells me that they may have done something so that I cannot remember what happened while I was with them. They clearly told me things based on what I told her, like the fact that I couldn't go back to space, but I genuinely cannot remember anything past that. Obviously, I have nothing in ways of evidence to back any of this up beyond my own memories. But I know what happened, and now that I remember it all, I cannot stop thinking about it. I know that a lot of people will disregard this story as they do, but that's okay. They don't have to believe what I went through, so as long as I remember it. I am curious to see if any of you listeners have any stories like this, and while I want to be anonymous, I will be reading the comments when you use this story to see if anyone has a similar experience. Thank you for reading. Much love, and God bless. And here are the top comments for my last video. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.